And we got so excited because for us, when we opened the box, it was smelled of home.
Hello and welcome to Holding Heritage. This is a space to explore and have honest conversations around the Asian North American experience. We'll focus on Canadian refugee stories, family, heritage, and bridging generational gaps. My name is Holly. Thank you so much for joining me. Hello, and welcome to another Building Heritage episode. In Building Heritage episodes, we focus on topics through a more present lens, discussing and sharing how we are learning, building, and upholding our heritage today. In today's episode, I'm really happy to be able to introduce you to Raymond. He shares pieces of his wonderful family stories. We chat about things like their journey to Canada being government sponsored, opening the first Southeast Asian grocery in Winnipeg, being the first to bring Sriracha to Canada. We also discuss how food is an incredible conduit to preserving culture and heritage. So keep on listening and let's dive right in. First, a little bit about Raymond. He's got an incredibly warm and welcoming spirit. Talking with him feels like talking with family, and he's incredibly knowledgeable, kind, experienced, and well-traveled. The passion he carries for his family's history, memories, food, and continuous learning really shine through in conversation. I feel really lucky to be able to chat with and learn from him. Raymond's family lived and thrived in South Vietnam up until being forced to leave and arriving in Canada in 1979. At the time that they left Vietnam, Raymond was just a young boy around the age 10 or 11.
So our family came in 1979, at the
Right.
beginning. So I guess we left around the same time as your family, as the ethnic Chinese, so the second wave that left. And
Yep.
we left for very similar reasons because we're, during the tussle with China, right?
Oh, okay. So where in Vietnam were you from?
We're
Your
from Bạc
family.
Liêu. If you look at the map of Vietnam, Bạc Liêu is pretty much the southernmost point of the map.
Oh, okay.
So our
Gotcha.
family is basically, south of the delta, pretty much. If you pass all the tributaries of the delta, we're past that. And so for us to go to Malaysia is actually a closer route than Hong Kong,
So you guys
right?
went to Malaysia and then you were in a camp in Malaysia, which
Yeah,
then you were put on the first plane out of that camp to Canada then.
that's right. We went to Kuala Lumpur first, and then from Kuala Lumpur, we went to Singapore for a stopover. And then from Singapore, we came to Vancouver, and then Vancouver, we were put to Winnipeg.
So it was your whole, you said a family of 10, all of you stayed together
Yeah,
on the same boat and everything. That's
yeah.
incredible.
So very similar to your family story. The boat, I remember, I think was something, approximately, I think the number were disputed by different family members. I think it's something between 14 and 16 meters.
Yeah.
It was 154 people on the boat. But I don't remember, being perilous on the boat. I was 10 or 11 at the time. And I remember I saw dolphins. It was 3 days, 2 nights on the boat.
So you didn't feel scared?
No, yeah, I think also because when you're that age, you're too young to experience all the emotions in life, right? So whatever emotions that you have, you develop later in life. Right? So at that age, not all your emotions are developed yet. You just experience what you have gained at that stage of your life, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so I think for me, thank goodness at that age of my life, I haven't experienced all the traumas in life. So I just experienced what I experienced up to that stage in my
Yeah.
life, right? So
Right.
I guess
Yeah.
looking back was natural for me that I didn't experience all the pain and trauma because I haven't experienced that yet. So I saw joy, I saw
Right.
dolphin, I saw sunshine, and that was okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah. And
absolutely.
yeah, so after 2 nights and 3 days, because we left at the crack of dawn, and we got to Malaysia at dusk, and they didn't want us to land. So we just continue on. And after, I think, close to midnight, we just rammed the boat up to shore further down the coast. And we just basically jump off the boat and everybody just got on the beach. And that's how we
Wow.
landed in Malaysia. I remember people came to see us and they took a whole bunch of yellow rope and they were tying it from one palm tree to another and roped us in.
Wow. So around the beach so that you were
Roped in,
confined to the
literally.
beach.
Yeah, yeah. And then the very next morning, people just brought huge pots of potato and beef soup and rice. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember that was the very, very first moment I felt marginalized. Like there was a division between us and them. That was the very first moment in my life. I felt, wow, there is a difference between us and them. People are not
Yeah.
allowed to touch me, and there's a rope between me and that population on the other side, right?
Was that confusing for you as a kid or?
Very much. Very much. I wasn't allowed to cross the road. I was not allowed to cross that rope. It was very, very confusing because up to that point, we weren't super wealthy, but we were comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
We were not marginalized. We could go anywhere that we wanted to go in the little city that we came from.
Yeah.
I
Mm-hmm.
went to a nice school. I had uniforms. You know, we had, housekeepers, and even the housekeepers ate with us at the same table. There was no such thing as marginalization in the
Mm,
way that we were raised. So for
right.
me to see that, I remember how strange it felt.
So, from the refugee camps in Malaysia, Raymond and his family, while going through the sponsorship application process, ended up choosing Canada.
So we were the first plane load that were government sponsored. So we're not church
Oh.
sponsored, we were government sponsored around the same time that I guess the Canadian population felt like they need to respond to the boat people exodus
Mm,
that were
mm-hmm.
all over the refugee camp in Southeast Asia. So we were accepted by the scoop essentially.
Yeah. How did you get the connections to that group?
Well, first of all, we were rejected by Australia. We were also rejected by France, even though that we have a connection with relatives in France, because
Right.
my brother's wife's family at that time has family in France since the 1940s. We didn't want to go to France at the time because France at that time had a socialist government.
I
So,
see.
so we just said, well, we just left the socialist government. We didn't want to go to another socialist government.
Right.
And of course, everybody at that time wanted to go to the US, and the US were not keen to accept people, because everybody wanted to go. And then Canada were very generous. They
Mm-hmm.
accepted us. So we thought,
Right.
well, we can't wait any longer. A family unit of 10, mom, dad, six boys, my sister,
So, was this from a refugee camp?
refugee camp. And, there's a whole bunch of decisions that were made by the Canadian government in between, as to
Right.
why we were settled in Winnipeg because
Mm-hmm.
of my dad's profession. That, it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't our decision that we were put in Winnipeg.
While in the refugee camps, of course, Raymond's family had lost everything that they had in Vietnam. Accepting the government sponsorship to Canada was their best option in the moment, and even then, they weren't particularly informed of all of the logistics and processes to follow. Finding a new home was their first and foremost priority. Raymond tells me about how the experience was particularly difficult on his father, something that is incredibly common among many refugees coming to a new country.
And my dad was actually quite traumatized by the whole experience, ever since we came to Canada. And
Mm-hmm.
he suffered from it quite a bit, his mental health. And I think when we came to Canada, he didn't quite process it all. It was quite
Yeah.
traumatic for him, and he
Mm-hmm.
wasn't able to talk about it, so he spent a lot of his time since we came to Canada pretty much as a shut-in.
Yeah. Wow.
That's very, very typical for people. He came to Canada a little younger than I am now, so I think he wasn't even 50 years old.
Oh.
So he basically just gave up on any future prospects for
Oh.
himself when he came to Canada. So
Mm-hmm.
it is really, really
Mm-hmm.
tough for him. I think.
Yeah,
Well, I know, not I think, I know, you know?
absolutely. Before having to leave Vietnam, Raymond's family had what sounds like an incredibly comfortable life. They were successful, thriving, and happy. In the small town where they lived, Raymond remembers having a simple home when he was younger, but over time he watched his dad rebuild the home, taking over 2 years to complete during the war. He put so much work into it and was really sculpting his dream home. It became one of the biggest houses in the neighborhood and was a home that fostered so many memories for the whole family.
Well, we lost
Yeah.
everything. That was in exchange for leaving the
Yeah.
country without being imprisoned.
Right.
Right? So we had textile factories in Vietnam where
Oh.
we manufacture khăn tắm. Khăn tắm is your parents would know this, is the blue and white cloth that were a symbol of the Revolutionary Army in the South that wore, and then the North would wear the red one. It's what they wear on their head, but it's also very convenient because farmers would wear this to wipe off the
Mm.
sweat. They would use it to carry things, and it's quite beautiful actually. I'm trying to get one for myself,
Yeah.
but it's also a symbol of the peasants. So anyway, my parents would make this,
Mhm.
and also the fabric for mosquito nettings.
Mm.
And we had two factories that make that.
Wow.
So we would actually have the facility to manufacture from, just bolts of raw cotton all the way to bolts of fabric where people would just buy from us.
Wow.
And I think we had that factory for 2, 3
Oh
generations.
my God.
Like we automate everything.
Yeah.
And so the reason why we didn't leave until quite late is because having factories, we were still considered as part of the country infrastructure. That we were still
Mm.
considered as useful, to the country.
Right.
So they kept telling us that we didn't have to leave and we were favored by the country and so on. So
Mm.
no, you don't have to leave. And then when that tussle happened with China, they turned on us
Oh.
and to say, if you don't go, you're now enemy of the state. And not only that, because you're now capitalist,
So they just took the factories away from you.
pretty much. And our homes, and our home, my dad built his dream home when he was less than 40, and he spent so much time designing it basically to his dream. And he had less than 5 years living in it. And I remember he chose the tiles, and the tiles were basically in shades of jade because that's my mom's name.
Oh.
My mom's name is Ngọc
Mhm.
or Yuk, right? Yuk is Ngọc. Ngọc is jade.
Oh, that's so beautiful. What a beautiful
Yeah.
story.
And all the banisters were actually also in shades of jade, and it's all hand honed. And it's had 4 floors, with the top floor collects rain that would empty into 2 huge cisterns under the house, and would only use the water that is collected from the rain. So we were completely, off grid, if you like.
Completely self-sufficient on your own. Wow.
Yeah. So the house is really, really cool. And the third floor is basically a garden. Has over 100 varieties of plants up there in large pots that my dad had collected and purchased and had it imported and so on. And in the evening, that's where we would hang out because it's the coolest part of the
Yeah.
house, but it shades the house from the hot sun.
Your family, or your dad specifically, like you said, put so much effort and heart into building that house. It's beautiful, but it's also so heartbreaking to then think that it was taken away from you and that your dad really struggled with that after coming to Canada. I mean, I would understand.
Yeah, and he had a difficult childhood too,
Mm.
my father, because he came from a pretty difficult background because my grandfather had escaped from China, under pretty difficult circumstances.
Raymond shared with me a little bit about his father's upbringing, and one that was incredibly poignant was the unfortunate passing of his mother at a young age.
So I think my dad had a lot of that struggle that he never had time to process or to
Absolutely.
talk about. Even, there was no vocabulary pretty much for him
Yeah.
before he passed,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
So, anyways, that was pretty much, my dad's
Yeah.
struggle. But before we escaped, those years were tough for our population because your family is Cantonese, but our family is Teochew.
Teochew people, also Teochew in Cantonese, are a group of ethnic Han Chinese people native to the prefecture now known as Chaoshan region of eastern Guangdong province in China. Teochew people usually speak the Teochew dialect and identify with Teochew culture, cuisine, and customs.
Teochew is a population that is also very, very different than the Cantonese, right? In Vietnam, I think that we're even a little bit more marginalized than the Cantonese. The Cantonese had a lot of the commerce, but the Teochew are usually the workers. We're the manual labor people. We're like the Hakka. Like with the Hakka, they get sent to Canada to build the railway. So that's who we are. I think it's not the same anymore because I think the Teochew now are different because there's some notable Teochew that are in the Chinese Politburo right now. They're very, very powerful.
Right.
But historically, that's not the case, right?
Yeah.
The Chinese were very divisive among ourselves,
Yeah.
right? We would find a fault and then we even find a fault within the fault.
Yes.
That's what happened when you have a large population. So it doesn't matter where we go, we always find that we've been marginalized even further.
Right.
So when we got to Winnipeg, we didn't find home right away with the Chinese population within Winnipeg.
Right.
And one interesting detail about how we were assigned to Winnipeg was because of my dad's profession that was recorded on his immigration paper in the refugee camp. They asked, so what's your profession? Well, my dad answered, said, well, I make textiles. He said that in Vietnamese. Through the translation, it got recorded. It says weaver.
Oh no.
So Winnipeg at that time, other than Montreal, it had sewing factories.
Okay.
So 2 weeks later, mom and dad, who never worked, manually in their lives, found themselves working in a sewing factory in Winnipeg for minimum wage.
Wow. So the government, because it was government sponsored, right? So were you guys given a home for a certain amount of time, or like were you the kids sent to school and things like that?
So the difference between church sponsor and government sponsor means that I think we were moved into an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment. My brother and sister were already of age, so they didn't go to school. They had to go to work right away.
Right.
And I think they get the first month of rent paid for until they receive the first paycheck.
Okay.
And we were moved into, so mom and dad and 5 of us were moved into a 2-bedroom, and mom and dad went to work right away until we received the first paycheck, until mom and dad had the first paycheck and we go to school. And then we get a hamper of food. We basically have to pay for the airfare for our crossing from Malaysia.
Oh, you had to pay for that?
Yes.
They paid for it first, but you had to pay it back?
That's right. So we get interest-free for the first 2 years. After 2 years, interest would accrue. So our first priority would be, how are we going to pay for this back before we have to pay for interest?
Yeah. Wow.
So that was our priority.
While at the same time, you're still having to make money to buy food and pay rent and things like that.
That's right.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's what it meant by government sponsors.
I had no idea. That's so interesting.
But that was not made known to us at the refugee camp, right? We had nothing because all the money that we had, we basically converted because everything was confiscated. So whatever that we could scrape together to convert it into gold bars to pay for our exit, we did that. So by then, we basically had nothing left because whatever asset that we had in the bank, not only that they froze that so that you can't withdraw, but they also devalue the currency. Right?
Yeah.
They devalued the currency, I think, from 1975 to 1978 when we left. They devalued currency twice.
Wow.
And they did that also by saying that, okay, now everybody is going to be equally poor. So everything that you have, you're now going to have the equivalent of, let's say, $200 in the bank. So everybody will have the same amount of money in the bank. Whatever that you have in the bank, your balance is now $200. So I remember my parents, for fear of being labeled as wealthy, we would take cash that customer owe to us that have been paid but have not been taken to the bank, and they would just burn it like ceremonial joss paper in the courtyard. At night, we were being sent to bed early, and they just sat there. And it was the most, oh my God, it was the most painful thing to see.
It makes me cry.
Like this is,
Oh man. Yeah.
but what choice do you have, right? This is your hard-earned cash. You can get labeled as criminals for the money that you earn. So what choice do you have, right? The mental torture that they must have gone through. They basically they make them feel like they don't exist. They're just ghosts burning joss paper.
Yeah, like that all of their effort and everything that they have built was essentially worth nothing. It's really, really heartbreaking. Wow.
Yeah. So when we came to Canada, there were circumstances that just like your asset just disappear overnight.
Like you have nothing,
right?
Nothing. It's almost like your past life is literally just a memory. There's nothing left to go back to or to carry forward.
Yeah, your physical assets are frozen. Anything that you have in the bank is gone. So anything that you have in gold is the only thing that you have, but then you have to pay for your crossings with that. And then when you get to Canada, whatever experiences that you have is now reduced to being a weaver, and you are now earning minimum wage, and now you have to pay for your crossings, to come to Canada. And then, if you don't pay that for the next 2 years, interest is going to accrue. So anyway, as soon as we did that, I remember each crossing, there were 10 of us. Yeah. So my brother, my oldest brother, my oldest sister, also making minimum wage, and my mom and dad, the four of them, managed to save up $5,000, was $500 each of us. $5,000 after 2 years, pay off that. And then on top of that, they managed to save $10,000. So basically, within 2 years, I'm trying to do the calculation here, and I don't know how the hell that worked, but it did.
So the four of them had made essentially $15,000 working minimum wage.
Yeah, saved up $15,000 plus living expenses for 10 of us, pay rent for 3 apartments. I try to calculate it, but I'm not sure how that worked. But they made it work, and they went to school at night.
Wow.
So after all that, after 2 years, we opened the store with $10,000. But it was also good because then my mom and dad can stop working for other people.
Right.
And they can work at the cash, they can work in their own language, they can meet other people of our own background. It can be a hub for the community.
It was a Chinese grocery market, right?
It was a Chinese grocery store. Right. Well, there were other Chinese grocery stores already in Winnipeg, but I remember it was a place for groceries that you couldn't find elsewhere. And it was so exciting for us because we were able to source groceries that we couldn't find elsewhere.
How did they do that? Were you importing?
Yeah. Okay, first of all, we got so excited. The Sriracha, before it was called Sriracha?
Yes.
We were the first to bring it to Canada.
Really?
Yes. Before, they only had the Vietnamese name. It was called Tương ớt tỏi Việt Nam. That was the only name. If you contact that guy's parents, they would know our family. We were the first to bring them to Canada. We had to pay so much for import duties.
So your parents, did they already know them, or they made the connection?
No, we went to California. We liked it so much. We import them.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, but we didn't know about distribution rights. We just liked it so much. We just buy, a few cases, and we just pay import duties through the nose. And we're just selling them in Winnipeg, in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, in northwestern Ontario. So we just, small scale. We were the first to sell those.
Oh, that's amazing.
So yeah. and also the all the herbs that you see now, like rau gue and rau gum, ram, and all of that. We were the first to get them into Canada because we found this family in Hawaii, a friend of a relative of a family in Hawaii, and we would actually get boxes of them that shipped to us in Winnipeg on a weekly basis before anyone else in Canada would actually have them. And this was in the early 80s, 81, 82, because no one else would even have them, not even in Vancouver. And we
Right.
got so excited because for us, when we opened the box, it was smelled of home.
Wow. Your grocery store then must have been such an amazing part of the community, like having other Asians feeling the same way of going into your grocery store and being like, wow, a piece of home. Where did you get this? How did you find this?
And another thing that a lot of people don't appreciate, there's a lot of Mennonite colonies and communities and communes, around Winnipeg.
Yeah.
And they would do hovitlong, the duck eggs that are partially hatched just for us. This was in the early 80s. They would do that just for us. I mean, I would only eat it selectively. Okay, I'm not a fan, I have to admit. But there are people in our community, the people who only eat it when it's 10 days, when there's 15 days, when there's only, So there was this Mennonite family who would do it for us. We're talking the early 80s, okay?
Yeah.
They would do it to our specification, like a certain case for us. Yeah.
And like many different Asian communities eat those duck eggs.
Yeah, like Filipino, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. It's not just us, So it was so incredible and because for us that's home to have those specific things. You couldn't get that anywhere, and to have that herb that goes with it, which is ram, right? Can you imagine after your traumatic experience having how many months or years in the camp, and then you come to Canada and you have that taste that it just bring you back to your most peaceful time. For me, I think the grocery store for my family to be able to source that from other cultures, from the Mennonite farmers, and then the herbs from Hawaii, and to bring that together in Winnipeg. I think it's just a beautiful juxtaposition.
It really is. Yeah. It sounds like your parents and your family slowly kind of pieced together all these bits from their old home in their new home.
But it's not conscious, right? I think it wasn't conscious. It's the ability to just make do with whatever it is that is in front of you. Oh, you have duck eggs. Could you just bring, us after it's being hatched for 10 days? I mean, they would look at us and think that we were like monsters. But we didn't care.
I would have loved to see their reaction. Like, why do you want these eggs? We eat them. Oh, man. I love hearing about Raymond's family experiences opening the first Southeast Asian grocery store in Winnipeg. Everything from his parents and eldest siblings working incredibly hard to save up money to sourcing all the foods, herbs, and delicacies that helped them step a bit closer to their lives in Vietnam. It really reminds me of the overarching refugee stories and experiences we always hear about, all that seem to capture the amazing resilience, survival, and evolution of hard work and dedication of refugees that come to a new country, having lost everything, and still having the capacity and strength to persevere and really live again. One thing among many that Raymond and I have in common is our love for our cultural foods. We chatted about our thoughts on how food can be its own language and how it can oftentimes be such a great starting point for connecting intergenerationally. Raymond is such an advocate for preserving cultural cuisine, and it is a big part of his personal goals moving forward.
It's always a good conduit, for us to touch on whatever it is that we are not willing to talk about. Food is always a good conduit. Oh, remember mom used to make this. Oh, remember we used to have this. Then, through that process, something else will always come out, right? And I think it's safe. Food is safe.
It is. Yeah.
What I remember as a child is that we made everything from scratch. But food now has changed to everything that we know is manufactured. What I remember is that food was made from raw ingredients. And a lot of that recipe has disappeared. So I'm now trying to get a lot of that recipe from my relatives who are still around and trying to get the story from the past, connecting that with the present and so on. So that I think it's important. And my aunt, she still makes a lot of our recipes from scratch. And food from the south is very, very different from the central and the north as well, because our food is very regionalized. And there's not a lot of published recipes. So I'm trying to get my family to talk. But with our family, if you don't hit the right note, it's really, really difficult to get them to share.
Absolutely. They kind of have to be
Right.
in the right mood. But exactly like you said, I think food is a really great avenue because it almost feels like it's easier for them to reminisce on a taste or something like that rather than diving straight into a story.
And I tried to do that with my aunt. I remember walking around while she was cooking with a notebook, and she said to me, you're too educated to have your food taste any good. I said, what? What? So basically, she's saying, because I'm trying to, get to the minutia of all the measurement, right? And she said, stop it. She said, just taste, right? So that's what she meant to say, because essentially what she was saying is like each lime, depends on where it's grown and how it's grown, has different acidity. Can't just, say, well, how many milliliter that will come to, she said, just use your tongue and not your head. So she didn't say that. She said, you're too educated to have your food taste any good.
That is so interesting, because me wanting to talk to my mom or my grandma about like, how do you make this? They'll be like, well, one bowl of this much soy sauce and this much this. And you're like, no, but like how much? And it's exactly the same thing as what your aunt said to you. Kind of brings up the question in my mind of how do we in a Western world now find a healthy balance between the two, wanting to preserve our culture, but also keeping that authenticity of you have to use your senses and the taste. Like that's really what makes it traditional. That's what is the heart of it. That's culture. That is cultural food.
Yes. So that's what I'm trying to tell my nieces and nephews. Like, don't get to the minutia with just measurements, but use other senses to get to the recipes, because each lime, each lemon, just use your taste. Don't just get to the milliliter of the measurements, but taste. Your tongue will tell you. Yeah. So I'm trying to connect the two generations by trying to untangle what she meant.
Along with being passionate about food, Raymond is also a cook himself and has classes available. He's currently working with In My Kitchen Vancouver, which is an organization that offers immersive culinary adventures from cooks of many different diverse cultures. They share their unique recipes, so be sure to head to inmykitchen.ca to check it out. Raymond's next class will be online on August 29th, and he's going to be teaching you his own family recipe for making bún, which is Vietnamese rice vermicelli. He'll be teaching you all about the basics of this Vietnamese noodle bowl and, of course, sharing more of his stories. So there we have it. This brings an end to today's episode with Raymond. I hope you've enjoyed listening and were perhaps able to relate to some of the things we chatted about. Be sure to also head to holdingheritage.com. Check out the episode show notes for some awesome photos and additional context and information. Thank you again for tuning in, and I will meet you back here very, very soon. Bye! Music by Blue Wednesday. Be sure to check him out. He's amazing. And as always, Holding Heritage is created, produced, and geographically based on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Tsleil-Waututh and Comox nations of the Coast Salish peoples.